Hello and welcome to another episode of Reading Together from Sea Harp Press. I'm Eugene Luning, co-founder of Sea Harp, and today I'm always excited to be diving into C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. We are in the middle of Book 3, which is where Lewis really pivots to taking a look at the realities of the Christian faith. And what I'm going to do, this is chapter 6 of Book 3. It's called Christian Marriage. It's quite a long chapter for this book, so I'm going to split it into two parts. It's about 11 pages in this HarperCollins edition, so we'll do about 5 pages today and 6 in the next episode. So again, chapter 6 of book 3, the title again, Christian Marriage. Let's dive in. The last chapter was mainly negative. I discussed what was wrong with the sexual impulse in man, but said very little about its right working. In other words, about Christian marriage. There are 2 reasons why I do not particularly want to deal with marriage. The first is that the Christian doctrines on this subject are extremely unpopular. The second is that I have never been married myself and, therefore, can speak only at second hand. But in spite of that, I feel I can hardly leave the subject out in an account of Christian morals. The Christian idea of marriage is based on Christ's words that a man and wife are to be regarded as a single organism. For that is what the words one flesh would be in modern English. And the Christians believe that when he said this, he was not expressing a sentiment, but stating a fact. Just as one is stating a fact when one says that a lock and its key are one mechanism, or that a violin and a bow are one musical instrument. The inventor of the human machine was telling us that its 2 halves, the male and the female, were made to be combined together in pairs, not simply on the sexual level, but totally combined. The monstrosity of sexual intercourse outside marriage is that those who indulge in it are trying to isolate one kind of union, the sexual, from all the other kinds of union which were intended to go along with it and make up the total union. The Christian attitude does not mean that there is anything wrong about sexual pleasure any more than about the pleasure of eating. It means that you must not isolate that pleasure and try to get it by itself any more than you ought to try to get the pleasures of taste without swallowing and digesting, by chewing things and spitting them out again. Now, I have to say, as we dive into a chapter about marriage by an unmarried man at the time, he was a later married man himself, I want to say that right there is a brilliance of Lewis, having never experienced marriage. Because it's this idea within the culture of his day as well as ours, that the isolation of sexual pleasure apart from all its meaningfulnesses, that can be something beneficial to us, that is really what the whole last chapter was about. The idea that we would isolate the pleasure and not deal in the realities that go all around it and frankly lead up to it. What do I mean by that? Well, I often talk frankly in our church fellowship and with the various retreats, Bible studies, etc. that I'm involved with. Whenever I get the chance to talk about the glories of marriage and sex itself, I always want to remind people that that pleasure is actually a function of all of it. All of the fun moments, the friendship, the service back and forth. Even when you start having children, the way that you do life together as a team with those children, all of it is wrapped into the pleasure that is to come in sex. Because sex is really born out of the friendship of marriage, out of the glorious day by day, even the mundane that you're going through together is creating an intimacy. And that pleasure that comes when you come together, well, friends, that's a function of all the rest. I've already referenced this yesterday when I was recording the last episode. There's that famous, in the late 1940s and into the 50s, sort of that foundational report, the Kinsey report, that essentially identified human beings as sexual beings. The reason I think that's in some ways so small, so limiting about the human condition is even borne out in our sexual relationships inside marriage. The little while you might enjoy the intimacy of sex in any given day is so small compared to all that came before and all that will come after. They are all of a piece, like a lock and a key, but it's really that friendship of marriage that makes the sexual side of it such a joy. So I love that Lewis, even as an unmarried man, kind of gets it. We cannot isolate the pleasure from the pleasures that actually lead toward that pleasure. That's important. Let's keep reading. As a consequence, Christianity teaches that marriage is for life. There is, of course, a difference here between different churches. Some do not admit divorce at all. Some allow it reluctantly in very special cases. It is a great pity that Christians should disagree about such a question. But for an ordinary layman, the thing to notice is that the churches all agree with one another about marriage a great deal more than any of them agrees with the outside world. I mean, they all regard divorce as something like cutting up a living body, as a kind of surgical operation. Some of them think the operation so violent that it cannot be done at all. Others admit it as a desperate remedy in extreme cases. They are all agreed that it is more like having both your legs cut off than it is like dissolving a business partnership or even deserting a regiment. What they all disagree with is the modern view that it is a simple readjustment of partners, to be made whenever people feel they are no longer in love with one another or when either of them falls in love with someone else. And I want to just pause before I go on. I'm well aware, whenever I record a video like this or when I speak live to people, that when we deal in the biblical understandings of marriage and of divorce, that oftentimes I'm speaking to people in the room who are divorced. I don't know their situation. I don't know what precipitated that movement to that decision. But I do want to remind you, even if you're divorced, that the Lord sees you, that He loves you, that He is even yet working out His good plans in your life. So I don't want you to hear this language and think, oh, well, there's one more place for me to feel shame, regret, guilt. The Lord Jesus is continually beckoning you nearer, even where you are now. So don't forget it, and don't forget His merciful love. I'll keep going. Before we consider this modern view in its relation to chastity, we must not forget to consider it in relation to another virtue, namely justice. Justice, as I said before, includes the keeping of promises. Now, everyone who has been married in a church has made a public, solemn promise to stick to his or her partner till death. The duty of keeping that promise has no special connection with sexual morality. It is in the same position as any other promise. If, as modern people are always telling us, the sexual impulse is just like all our other impulses, then it ought to be treated like all our other impulses. And as their indulgence is controlled by our promises, so should its be. If, as I think, it is not like all our other impulses, but is morbidly inflamed, then we should be specially careful not to let it lead us into dishonesty. To this, someone may reply that he regarded the promise made in church as a mere formality and never intended to keep it. Whom then was he trying to deceive when he made it? God? That was really very unwise. Himself? That was not very much wiser. The bride or bridegroom or the in-laws? That was treacherous. More often, I think, the couple, or one of them, hoped to deceive the public. They wanted the respectability that is attached to marriage without intending to pay the price. That is, they were impostors. They cheated. If they are still contented cheats, I have nothing to say to them. Who would urge the high and hard duty of chastity on people who have not yet wished to be merely honest? If they have now come to their senses and want to be honest, their promise, already made, constrains them. And this, you will see, comes under the heading of justice, not that of chastity. If people do not believe in permanent marriage, it is perhaps better that they should live together unmarried than that they should make such vows they do not mean to keep. It is true that by living together without marriage, they will be guilty in Christian eyes of fornication. But one fault is not mended by adding another. Unchastity is not improved by adding perjury. The idea that being in love is the only reason for remaining married really leaves no room for marriage as a contract or promise at all. If love is the whole thing, then the promise can add nothing. And if it adds nothing, then it should not be made. The curious thing is that lovers themselves, while they remain really in love, know this better than those who talk about love. As Chesterton pointed out, those who are in love have a natural inclination to bind themselves by promises. Love songs all over the world are full of vows of eternal constancy. The Christian law is not forcing upon the passion of love something which is foreign to that passion's own nature. It is demanding that lovers should take seriously something which their passion of itself impels them to do. This is an interesting point, and it's almost gloriously logical in the way he states it. As Chesterton points out, those who are in love have a natural inclination to bind themselves by promise. When we are in that sort of like first flush of love, where we're just like unrestrainedly like in love, like the emotionalism of it has completely overshadowed everything else, well, yes, we sit across from that person and we bind ourselves with all kinds of strong words. But then, as Lewis points out, we kind of do the judicial thing. We stand in front of the public, our in-laws, our friends, and we say, yes, I promise for a lifetime. But I want to strip it back, you know how I like to do this, to the reality that life is really lived in the now. The kind of marriage that you want to have is today. Or frankly, the way that today is going is the kind of marriage that you are shaping for tomorrow. So, as people who are filled with emotion, you and I just want to always dial it down to the fact that you and I can make a choice to go back to the first fruits of our love with our spouse, or maybe you're engaged right now, or maybe you're dreaming about marriage someday. Today, we can be the kind of people that Jesus is calling us to be in our marriage, in our being engaged, in our dreams of someday being married. We can be that person today in Jesus. And if some of the emotionalism with which you first met this spouse or fiancé feels a little kind of dialed down, well, serve that person. Look for ways to make yourself less. Look for ways to, in fact, give over your expectancies of them and simply love them for who they are. Today is a day you can recapture the truth of love in your marriage by serving, by looking for that little thing in that person that first drew you to them in a way that honors them. It doesn't all have to be like roses and chocolates and carried away emotion all the time, but each day we can serve each other in a way that actually does elevate the other. Makes them realize that you do in fact love them actively. So I challenge you, today is the day. Have the kind of marriage you want to have by lifting up the life of that person with whom you are doing life. It's a kind of an exciting adventure. Let me keep reading. And of course, the promise made when I am in love, and because I am in love, to be true to the beloved as long as I live, commits me to being true even if I cease to be in love. A promise must be about things that I can do, about actions. No one can promise to go on feeling in a certain way. He might as well promise never to have a headache or always to be hungry. But what, it may be asked, is the use of keeping two people together if they are no longer in love? There are several sound social reasons to provide a home for their children, to protect the woman who has probably sacrificed or damaged her own career by getting married from being dropped whenever the man is tired of her. But there is also another reason of which I am very sure, though I find it a little hard to explain. It is hard because so many people cannot be brought to realize that when B is better than C, A may be even better than B. A little formula here for us. They like thinking in terms of good and bad, not of good, better, and best, or bad, worse, and worst. They want to know whether you think patriotism a good thing. If you reply that it is, of course, far better than individual selfishness, but that it is inferior to universal charity and should always give way to universal charity when the two conflict, they think you are being evasive. They ask what you think of dueling. If you reply that it is far better to forgive a man than to fight a duel with him, but that even a duel might be better than a lifelong enmity, which expresses itself in secret efforts to do the man down, they go away complaining that you would not give them a straight answer. I hope no one will mistake this mistake about what I am now going to say. And so even though it's a bit of a cliffhanger as I get to that spot, that's about the midpoint in this chapter. And so I want to bring back before you what's been said. First and foremost, that the promise of marriage is a very solemn thing. That the realities of being in love, meaning carried away with emotionalism, cannot define marriage, because otherwise it becomes sort of this helter-skelter sort of today and tomorrow I can just change my mind sort of thing that is not terribly healthy for our human hearts. Well, Lewis is about to take us even further into this reality of being in love, because he wants to bring us back to the heart of love, to that one that we often read at marriages, 1 Corinthians 13, which is a picture of the heart of Jesus and should be the heart of our married love day by day. So thank you for joining me for the first half of Chapter 6 of Book 3 in Mere Christianity. I know I've left you on a bit of a cliffhanger, but you can always watch the next episode. Thank you for joining me. It is such a pleasure to be with you, and I'm so grateful for the comments that I get to see on our YouTube channel. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.